Hello, everyone, and welcome to Charities Chat number 3. I'm James Saunders. I'm hosting this one, and with me today is Catherine Rustomji from Shakespeare Martineau and Charles Mesquita from Quilter Cheviot, as always. And today we're going to talk about how well charities are currently being served in Parliament by our elected representatives in general, and by the government in particular, and ultimately by what is now going to be a new Prime Minister. We are currently right now awaiting the final decision on who's going to be the Prime Minister from the last two of Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. So we're going to look at those a bit later, but first of all, the first question, and Catherine, I'll direct this to you first. How well is the charity sector, and has it been served in Parliament recently, given the Tory party, the Conservative Party, hasn't got a designated minister for charities at the moment, hasn't had for some time. The current one is Nigel Huddleston, who also covers civil society, youth, sport, and tourism. And the Labour Party has elected or has allocated Barbara Keeley as their shadow minister for charities recently, with some decent credentials. But Catherine, how do you feel that the charity sector is represented in Parliament at the moment?
Sure. I mean, I think we've seen this previously as well, James, when people have their portfolio altered and charities was being passed around from pillar to post, whether it was civil society, whether it was third sector, whether it was added in with DCMS or moved to a different department. And it just always seemed to be as though nobody really wanted it, that nobody was really grabbing that as a topic, as an area to champion for the sector and to say, you know, these are the issues affecting charities. I think what we often see, I suppose, is MPs learning about little projects or pet projects that a charity has perhaps contacted them about. But I don't think in general there is an understanding of the size and scale of the sector, the work that it does, the variety of the different sorts of charities that exist. And I know Charles will have this to hand, but I think the context of understanding the size and scale in terms of number of employees, the financial contribution that the charity sector makes to our society, I don't think is any way proportionate to how it's reflected in terms of parliamentary time or effort or focus, really.
Charles, how about you?
Yeah, I completely agree, I'm afraid, with Catherine. I mean, you know, the last sort of 20 years. I mean, under the Blair government, there was no doubt about it. It was seen as an important part of government policy. And I think up to David Cameron and Big Society, I think that continued. I think the sign was the move from the Cabinet Office into the DCMS, and then adding on other things into the portfolio. You know, it surprises me, and you're right, Catherine, about the figures. I mean, you know, the figures coming out of the Charity Commission is the sort of the annual turnover of charities is 74 billion, you know, which is twice defence, half of NHS. Do we ever hear government ministers talk about it? And again, although you hear a lot of the right words, you very rarely see the action there, and you just and I wonder whether it's just because the sector's so diverse. And it's doing such a thing, and it's so knitted into society, you know, because you go from the local scouts groups up to the largest charities helping on, you know, global relief, and then of course, you know, is it right or wrong? Politicians should be slightly guiding things of how they give money. You know, you only go back to Kids Company, and one of the criticisms that came out of that report was the way that government funds charities. You know, the one area that hasn't actually ever been addressed is how government funds charities. So, you know, I get to a stage where it slightly depresses me about how little politicians seem to know about charities, trustees, and volunteering. But you will always hear them saying, oh yes, it's a very important part and they're a key part to our thinking and everything else.
I mean, having had a look back at recent history and our outgoing Prime Minister's efforts with the charity sector, at the beginning of Boris Johnson's reign, there was the Kruger report, which was commissioned, I think, by Boris Johnson about levelling up in response to the whole levelling up agenda as part of it. That was announced with some fanfare, but I mean, quite honestly, seems to have faded away. I think that rather, it seems to me that rather shows the recent history in a bit of a nutshell, really. There's been a lot of knee-jerk reactions to things. And perhaps it's not just the approach to the charity sector. It's you know, the recent Prime Minister's approach to everything has been knee-jerk reaction. Everything needs attention, and then it's on to the next thing straight away. You know, obviously COVID happened slap bang in the middle of all that, and the response from government was rapid in several areas. Not so much in the charity sector, it has to be said. It was definitely, the charity sector was definitely second fiddle to, for example, the arts sector, which was, you know, which had 1.5 billion immediately allocated to it. There was money for the charity sector eventually through COVID, but it wasn't enough, and it wasn't quick enough. I mean, Catherine, again, on that recent history, is there anything that you feel, you know, what feel do you have for the last 3-4 years or so, and what could we possibly learn for the future?
I mean, I would agree. I think that depth isn't there. I think that depth of policy, of understanding, of tactics, of strategy, you know, it seems to be this scattergun, or here's a project and an endeavour which may or may not continue and may never be mentioned again. You know, I think the Kruger report was very thorough. There was a lot of good information in there, and a lot of time had clearly been spent on it, but it's not really showing through in terms of, well, what is happening with the recommendations that were made from it, and where are the changes coming. And I think during COVID, you know, I think charities were forgotten initially. I think they were completely overlooked in terms of government support. And then when it came, you know, it was welcome. But to my mind, I think the difference between the charity sector and the arts sector, I really want to get into the political debate, but to my mind, that was more of those are the types of lobbying individuals that would approach Conservative MPs, and therefore they've looked after the sector that they were more interested in and more aware of. You know, so whether that is the opera, theatre, other arts organisations, rather than the grassroots day-to-day charitable activities that many people rely on, but are not the sort of, you know, jolly events that some of the MPs may have been familiar with attending. So it just seems to me that it's more it's used, I think, by MPs perhaps, rather than it being consistently applied.
Charles, I mean, we've touched on this before and in other realms, but what could and can the charity sector do to make more of the Levelling Up report, the Kruger report, or represent itself more and better to government and to Parliament?
I think it's extremely difficult, because I mean, I always thought that if the charity sector had some relatively simple messages, just reminding people of how important the sector is, how big it is, you know, how many people volunteer, you know, because I think it's extraordinary if you look at it. I can't remember what the numbers are, but it's about something like 60 million people volunteer regularly for charities, which is a big part of it. And actually, if you look at it once a year, and I'm not quite sure how they define the once a year, but that goes up to about 26 million people. You know, so you've got nearly half the population is going out and volunteering. So, you know, and if you go and talk to people in the street and everything else, they're very passionate, a lot of them, about their local organisations and get involved and happy to do so. But you know, this whole funding of charities has, you know, I mean, and partly this may be that there is a confusion of where the welfare state stops and charity starts. And I think that hasn't probably helped matters. But I just think that, you know, this whole relationship with government and the way that government pays charities to effectively deliver parts of the welfare state, and charities aren't very good at turning around and saying, terribly sorry, but actually we can't do this at the price you're going to be offering it, because they feel, understandably, a duty of responsibility to their beneficiaries that they don't want to let down. But the problem is you're then caught in a catch-22 situation. And for some reason, you know, if government seems to commission a private company to do something, the criteria that's required by the private company and scrutiny is completely different to what we expect from charities, which also seems to me completely and utterly bizarre. You know, and you know, we are really lucky in this country to have the number of organizations that we have doing what we're doing, from the very grassroots up to the largest. I mean, I can't think of any other country in the world that has that rich fabric. And, you know, for our politicians to be ignoring that, to me, I think is a real missed opportunity. But I think the sector, going back to your question, needs to work out how it reminds government and politicians around that. And unfortunately, I think simple and consistent messaging is probably the only way you can do it.
And presumably finding the right person to talk to, someone who is genuinely committed to the sector, would make a difference. I mean, the last point then is about the two Conservative MPs who might well be one of them will be our next Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss. Rishi Sunak has had some reports in the past about being a supporter of charities, although £100,000 to his old school, it's not quite as philanthropic as perhaps some might suggest, given the money that's there. Charities have been, sorely lacking in attention in his budget. So I would say, this is the accountant in me speaking, very little in recent years for the charity sector to really worry about or benefit from. And Liz Truss, I mean, I had a quick look. I couldn't particularly see anything that suggested she was a major supporter of the charity sector. So I wasn't particularly enthused by either of them on the charity sector. Catherine, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd be amazed if there was anything coming from the successful candidate about the sector in particular, whether that's a priority, at least initially, because I think whoever gets in, they're seeking to please their grassroots supporters, aren't they, with whatever, tactics they've offered or suggested that the changes that they would make. But I don't think the charity sector will feature anywhere at all in there.
Charles, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm certainly not holding my breath. I mean, I don't see there's any particular indication that there will be any change. And I mean, if you just look at, and sadly I have watched a couple of the debates that we've had so far, the whole social or levelling up or anything on that basis hasn't really featured in the campaign. So I can't see actually that changing, whoever does get into power. And also, they've been in power before for some time, and leopards and spots come to mind.
Okay, well, on that slightly negative point, unfortunately, we will finish our charity chat for this week, and hopefully we'll see you again very soon. All of our previous ones are available along with our more fuller webinars on our website. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.